Welcome everyone. This is a fantastic turnout. I really appreciate you coming out tonight. I'm Selena Gallo-Cruz from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at Holy Cross, and it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker on the topic of killer heat and climate change impacts in the United States. So before doing so, I want to first thank all of the faculty and staff who came together to make this event happen in a very short period of time. Specifically, I want to thank Tom Landy, Danielle Kane, and Pat Hinchcliffe from the McFarland Center. Professor Matthew Eggemeyer, I think I saw you out there somewhere in the Dean's office, was my first enthusiastic supporter. The Departments of Environmental Studies, Political Science, Sociology and Anthropology, and our student groups, EcoWatch and SGA's Environmental Concerns for their sponsorship of tonight's talk. Graphic Arts for making us the beautiful posters, our Paul and Brian here at AV Services, and especially Paula Hall in Sociology for her very generous and careful attention to all things logistical. I also want to thank the several community organizers who have come out tonight. I think they flyered you all on the way in. I saw a line of flyering to share information about the many wonderful initiatives that are happening here in our city. I hope you'll stop by their tables on the way out to read more about the upcoming declaration, the strikes, the rallies, and other transformative campaigns underway in Worcester. In fact, part of the reason I scrambled to get this talk early on the calendar in September was to extend support and empowerment for all of our first-year students that had to make it through The Uninhabitable Earth this summer by David Wallace Wells, and many of whom will join youth here in Worcester and around the world for our upcoming youth strike on Friday, September 20th, to ask our government to make necessary changes to address climate change. So with that said, I had the fortune of attending a UCS webinar on the findings of the report on extreme heat and its impacts in the United States this summer, and immediately thought I want to bring someone from UCS to Holy Cross to speak about this important report. What struck me as incredibly useful was the discussion of the impacts on the most vulnerable of our community, how we might think about how that should shape our infrastructure and our city planning going forward, and our public health sector as we address heat-related health impacts. Before introducing Erika Spanger-Siegfried, I'd like to just briefly say something about the association she represents. The Union of Concerned Scientists was founded in 1969 by scientists and students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That year, the Vietnam War was at its height, and Cleveland's heavily polluted Cuyahoga River had caught fire. Appalled at how the US government was misusing science, the UCS founders drafted a statement calling for scientific research to be directed away from military technologies and toward solving pressing environmental and social problems. Today, the Union of Concerned Scientists is a nonprofit alliance of more than 100,000 scientists and citizens that work to promote environmental and global security solutions based on sound science. UCS scientists, engineers, and analysts collaborate with colleagues across the country to conduct technical studies on renewable energy options, cleaner cars and trucks, the impacts of and solutions to global warming, the risks of genetically engineered crops, deforestation, invasive species, nuclear power plant safety, missile defense, the security of nuclear material, and other issues. Research results are shared with policymakers, the news media, and the public in order to shape public policy, corporate practices, and consumer choices. So now Erika Spanger-Siegfried, a senior analyst in the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, researches, writes, and speaks about US climate change impacts and preparedness. She currently oversees UCS's climate impacts analyses, including a portfolio of leading-edge work on sea level rise and extreme heat that help shed light on ongoing climate change impacts, current efforts to cope with these impacts, and the urgency of strong leadership and action. During her more than 20 years as a climate change professional, she has managed half a dozen large-scale, multidisciplinary climate research and engagement projects. So please join me in welcoming Erika Spanger-Siegfried.
It's an incredible turnout. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I'm really blown away. I'm so glad to see you all here tonight. Thank you. We're having a little bit of technical difficulty, so I'm going to be a bit more tethered to the podium than I would like tonight. So thanks for bearing with me. Let me know if I drift too far away from this mic. I want that in regular view, and this is
yeah.
Oh, we're still ironing things out. But my eyes have been going really just like the last 6 months, and I see a lot of young faces out there, but not so much in the back. I can't see y'all in the back. Can I see a show of hands? Who is actually attending college right now? Oh my God! Yes, thank you. I love speaking with younger audiences, and I mean in general, and especially right now in this moment in the lead up to the climate strike. Who of you is going to be involved in any climate strike activities? All right, and the rest of you, we'll talk later. Sign in? Oh, okay. Sorry about this. Okay, so while we're waiting, I'll just tell you a little bit about how I am hoping to run this conversation. I want to save a bunch of time to hear from you and talk about these issues. At UCS, I work on climate change impacts, and that's where my work has focused really for the last 15 years. So what we try and do is look at the ways in which climate change is affecting people today, and how it will affect them, impact them in the near future. And then we do our best to take that new science, because we have lots of scientists and analysts on staff, and we do leading edge new research. So how do we take that new science and package it and make it accessible to the general public, and make it impactful with policymakers, decision makers as well?
Just one after the side.
And we focus on impacts because there's so much at stake. And there's certainly much more at stake than we've been able to assess. We're really just scratching the surface. And if you all have read David Wallace Wells' book, you know full well that what's at stake is really quite vast and disheartening, and we have a lot of work to do. So what I want to do is take a little time to talk about the new analysis we did, looking at extreme heat. I had initially planned to do what I often do, which is, hey, everybody, let's all get on the same page about where we are with climate change. If everyone who raised their hand has read David Wallace Wells' book, I need to do a super abbreviated version of that. So bear with me, we'll skip along through it. And hey, look at this, we're in presenter mode. Well done. How about a hand to for these gentlemen here? Nice. All right, now let's see if I can figure this out. Okay. Forward click. All right, that's not working, so we're going to do this. All right, so as I said, we're going to do a quick, everybody on the same page, and then I want to talk about this new piece of work. So with summer in the rearview mirror for all of us, we tend to look back fondly on those hot days, but that's really changing, and those hot days are becoming more dangerous, and the dangerous days are becoming more frequent. Our analysis really wanted to give people a chance to see the pretty dramatic changes that are coming. If you all can think back to the July heat wave we experienced this past summer, that gives you a sense of the kind of days that we project are going to be happening quite often. All right, like I said, a very quick 101, bear with me. All right, so you've all seen this. You've been thinking about climate change, talking about climate change for some time. This is the 101, the 5 things. It's warming, it's us, we're sure it's bad, and we can fix it. I want to zip through those first 3, and for better or worse, most of my talk is about the it's bad part. But we are going to, we always close with, well, not close, we always couple the bad news with as much as we can say about the solutions. And there's a lot that we can say about the solutions. All right, so you all have seen some version or another of this chart. The reason I want to share it with you is because, as you may know, 18 of the 19 warmest years on record have occurred since 2001. Who was born 2001 or subsequently? Yeah, so you've lived every single year of your life in global record-breaking heat, right? And the 4 warmest years you can see up here are the last 4. So kids entering kindergarten have lived in the most extreme global average temperatures in recorded history. And it's interesting that those last 4 are really quite a lot warmer. So it begs the question whether we're entering some kind of a new warmer regime there. We know that it's us. You know, why is this black line rising? There are lots of things that affect the Earth's climate, both human and natural, but we know that natural drivers don't explain what's happening here with increasing global average temperature, and really only the human drivers make sense of this situation. We're sure. You know, every few years, scientists release a new report that says we're still really sure. And these are the latest, the IPCC's 1.5C report. Are folks familiar with that report, the 1.5C report? It's really worth checking out. Those of you who read the Wallace Wells book and are really starting to immerse yourselves in thinking about climate change, it's a really important report which explores the potential to get to 1.5 degrees C and the implications if we don't hit that target and the implications if we hit the 2C target. Really important stuff. So anyway, we're still sure. And it's bad. Okay, this is it's bad part A. Yes, we've raised global average temperatures 1 degree Celsius since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So what does that look like? One of the ways that seemingly modest amount of warming expresses itself is, of course, in hurricanes. So there are lots of visible effects, extreme events from storms, floods, droughts, wildfire, are increasing certainly in frequency and many in intensity. We have seen Maria, Irma, Harvey, Florence, Michael, and now most recently Dorian, just within a little over 2 years, incredibly devastating hurricanes. And last year alone, we obviously haven't tallied this year's disasters, but last year alone saw 14 major weather disasters that cost almost $100 billion and killed 247 people. This storm, of course, we're still coming to terms with. This is the Bahamas post-Dorian. So there are obviously very dramatic ways that 1 degree of warming is starting to express itself. And then, of course, there are lots of subtle ways. We've got the unraveling of the Arctic, but it is the Arctic and we don't see it on a regular basis. So that's a bit, those changes are incredibly important, as are these to the reefs of the world, the warm water reefs of the world. That 1 degree of warming has created enough increase in water temperatures that warm water reefs are obviously really suffering. But in 2016 and 17, those years that you saw at the top of that chart, 50% of the Great Barrier Reef died off. Those coral can recover in time, but they need cool waters. They need cool temperatures to get a break and to grow back. And its bad part B tells us that that's not where we're headed. We're headed for a warmer world, and at the present rate, we could hit 1.5 degrees C around 2040 and 2C around 2060. These whales are perfectly fine, but in my experience, you should only give so many bad news slides in a row, so we're just gonna pause here for a moment. They're actually napping, which is so cool. All right, moving on. So climate change is manifesting itself in all kinds of ways that are dangerous to us. We at UCS have been looking at coastal flooding, the threat to communities, to homeowners, to a range of vulnerable, exposed things along our coast. And we're now turning our attention inland to look at extreme heat. So this is the piece of work that we released this summer. We happened to be planning to release it for a year, the very week that the most oppressive heat wave in a long time struck the US. So this is the public-facing report, where we try and really kind of synthesize and translate and capture our results in a publicly accessible way. But we also, this is legit science, this is robust science, and we publish our work in the peer-reviewed literature. So here's the paper that I'd encourage you to check out if you're so inclined. So the reason we do this kind of analysis, I've touched on, right? We want people to understand how climate change is affecting their lives. It's not some random extreme event. It's a progression of increasingly dangerous extreme events that are affecting you. And we want people to be able to see these things coming and be able to get out ahead of them. We're never going to be able to catch up if we ignore climate change, fail to mitigate, fail to adapt. We're going to find ourselves in a whole lot of trouble. So our work focuses on bringing these changes to light. This past summer presented us with plenty of examples to make the connection for people between the kind of extreme heat that's really dangerous and oppressive and brings life to a grinding halt, and the frequency with which we should expect that kind of heat in the future. There was a massive heat wave across Europe, actually several waves of heat waves, and then there was this one in the US. Does anyone remember this heat wave? It was really quite something. I mean, in lots of states that aren't accustomed to this heat, life came to a screeching halt, right? 6 people actually died from direct heat-related illness, and ER visits, of course, spiked because extreme heat can make people can easily make people ill. So we did this analysis to see this coming. All right, so when we undertake this kind of analysis, we try to build on the best available methods, the best available data. We like to collaborate with external scientists. Here we use data from 18 high-resolution climate models, and by high resolution, I mean really high resolution across the entire US. I think it was like a 4x4 kilometer grid. We calculated the daily maximum heat index, or feels-like temperature, which I'll come back to, for every day through 2099. And we then tabulated how frequently days above different important public health heat index thresholds would occur. We ran the model with 3 different emissions scenarios, which I'll touch on, which are intended to kind of capture the range of potential future climate conditions. And then we aggregated that data for every major city, county, congressional district, and state in the lower 48. So the heat index. Most people are familiar with this being part of our weather forecasts now, right? The meteorologist will say it's going to be 90 degrees, but it feels like temperature of 98. And there are important reasons for that. When the humidity is high, we can't sweat, and sweating is our body's primary way of cooling itself. And so when you have, for example, a temperature outside of 90 and a humidity of 60, it will feel to your body like it's 100 degrees, right? If you step outside of the car in Arizona on a 100-degree day, it's going to feel hot, but not unbearably so. In Alabama, it's going to be a totally different situation. So we analyzed the changing heat index. We analyzed individual days with different heat index values. And then we also looked at these off-the-chart heat index, days with the heat index that are off the charts. And this was actually something we didn't expect to look at all. But it happened that when we were using the National Weather Service formula to calculate the heat index, we started getting these, squiggly numbers that didn't make any sense. Because once you get a temperature that's high enough and a humidity that's high enough, the National Weather Service formula says we don't recognize that as a heat index that occurs on planet Earth, and our formula can't calculate it. So these were essentially off-the-charts conditions, and we found a lot of them, starting in mid-century and increasing over the course of the century. So we looked at a few different values of the heat index. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, I hope I have that right, OSHA, recommends a threshold of 90 degrees, a heat index of 90 degrees, above which workers outdoors should take special precautions, have access to shade, lots of drinking water, because if you're exerting yourself in those conditions, it becomes dangerous. A heat index at or above 100 degrees becomes quite dangerous to physically vulnerable groups like kids, who just have physically a harder time cooling themselves. Elderly people whose bodies also don't cool themselves as well, people with medical conditions. And then at 105 degrees and above, everybody is at risk. This is when everyone needs to take extreme precautions. Now, mind you can get sick at any one of these thresholds, depending on your unique physiology and what you're up to. But these are the key thresholds that the National Weather Service observes and that we used in this analysis. And then, of course, there are the off-the-charts conditions where really any level of exposure is presumed extremely dangerous and can result in illness or even death. Just quickly about the scenarios we analyzed. These are global carbon emissions scenarios developed under the IPCC. There's a no action scenario. We chose to call it no action, which is the RCP 8.5 for those of you who have your heads in this space in the scientific literature. It's a scenario in which increases in global emissions continue to outpace our efforts to reduce emissions. It's a relatively high-end scenario, but it's important to note that it's the one that our actual emissions are currently tracking most closely. Then we also looked at a slow action scenario where emissions rise through the middle of the century and then really rapidly decline, and then a rapid action scenario where we sort of throw everything we've got at this problem and see deep reductions that are consistent with meeting that target of keeping global average temperatures below 2 degrees C. Okay, so with all of those pieces fed into this analytical process, here are some of the results we found. By mid-century, so in this 2036 to 2065 timeframe, we see a pretty steep increase in extreme heat. The maps here show that the number of days with a heat index above 100 degrees in that top row, and 105 in the bottom row, would increase, would double, the 100 degrees would double, and the number of days over 105 would quadruple in that mid-century time frame. You obviously see locations that are most heavily affected, the Sun Belt in particular. And that's a region that was, of course, developed with air conditioning, and people are used to things being hot. And we anticipated that when we released these results, but what we're hearing is we're not accustomed to these temperatures and these sort of unrelenting extreme temperatures. So we're talking about going from, in the historical period, a handful of days with a heat index above 105 to, in the mid-century, 50 to 100, and essentially the entire summer with those conditions that are dangerous and even deadly to healthy people. So we found that nationwide, with no action to reduce emissions, so this is with that no action scenario, by mid-century, 150 cities are projected to experience an average of 30 more days per year with a heat index above 105. So what you see in Southern California there, that's the number of cities, 3 nationwide, that currently experience 30 or more days per year with a heat index above 105. And by mid-century, we're expecting to see all of these. And it's important to bear in mind that our analysis did not factor in the urban heat island effect, which is an enormously important factor in cities for capturing the kind of heat that they'll deal with. And we aim to go back and take a closer look at that in a next round of analysis. So historically, fewer than 1 million people in the US have experienced those kinds of conditions. And by mid-century, about 92 million people, holding population constant today, about 92 million people compared to 1 million in the US would face those conditions. So I want to pause just for a moment before we go to late century to just consider some of the implications of this. When heat waves hit, certain people are hit harder than others. elderly folks, low-income people, people who can't pay their electricity bills. There are fatalities each year because people's electricity has been shut off during extreme heat, and they're isolated enough that in those conditions they can't cope. People of color, people with disabilities and medical conditions, people who have to work outdoors, and children. And again, our analysis does not factor in that urban heat island effect. It's not surprising that that certain people are going to be hit first and worst by extreme heat, and really already are. And it's important to know and to take forward the knowledge that it's the same people over and over again who are hit first and worst by some of our climate stressors and climate extremes. And when we think about adaptation, we need to be thinking about climate equity and climate justice as key components of that. So shifting to late century, nationwide, we'd see 8 times as many days per year with the heat index above 105 compared to the historic period. And whereas those off-the-charts conditions I mentioned have historically only affected the Sonoran Desert, that corner down there where Arizona meets California, and only for a couple of days each year, by late century, more than 60% of the US by area would experience those conditions at least once per year. And that would affect 120 or more million people, again, holding population constant. So more than a third of the current population of the US would be facing off-the-charts conditions, conditions that we don't experience today and don't know how to cope with, and that are obviously extremely dangerous. I'm sorry, in that time frame, roughly 120 million people would experience 7 days or more, a week or more of those off-the-charts conditions. So again, looking at cities, and these are, I should have mentioned, these are cities with a population of 50,000 or more. So this is by no means all the cities in the US. We just looked at a subset of those. This is kind of a good news, bad news slide. The good news is that reducing our emissions, as you can see here, limiting future warming to 2 degrees C globally or less would really drastically limit the expansion of extreme heat. Here we're comparing cities that would experience 30 or more days a year above 105, and with no action to reduce emissions, 290 cities, some as far north as Wisconsin, would face a month, essentially a month's worth of those extreme heat conditions. With rapid action, that number drops to just 85. Now, just 85 compared to 3 today is, it's good news, right? Good news is becoming relative. But certainly, you can see the expansion of extreme heat across cities, across so much of the US with that no action scenario. So we have packaged all of this data in a searchable online map, a story map, where you can go and drill down to your own community. You can look at the changes over time. And then if you want just a quick access to information, we have this widget where you can put your location in, and you can look at the changing frequencies. You can look at the different thresholds, the different time frames, and get some quick numbers back. And we also make all of the data available to download. And if people are interested in taking it and using it for their own analysis, looking at some of the implications, perhaps in Worcester, any number of things, by all means, we would really love to see that happen. And we've also created fact sheets for every one of the congressional districts. I can't remember, 400 and something. And hey, if you're going to be going to speak with your members of Congress, grab one and take it along. We do have some Spanish language material as well, and intend to be translating more of our work over time. All right, so obviously, failing to take action to reduce emissions leads to this really staggering expansion of extreme heat. And we had a hard time making sense of this. I don't know if the maps that I showed you communicated the transformation, really, of large parts of the country from places where you can go outside today, right, in the summer, where kids can have an outdoor childhood, where people can safely work outdoors, to a a country where there are huge expanses where that's no longer the case. If you're going to work outside, you need to work at night at best. Kids need to stay in air-conditioned spaces across large parts of the country in that mid-century time frame. And the projections just get worse. So, clearly, knowing that aggressive emissions reductions really contain that expansion, they don't stop it, right? We all know that the days of stopping climate change are over. And now we're trying to contain it, right? We're trying to control the pace at which it accelerates. But we can contain that expansion, and we have to start. Okay, so let's do that. We're at the we can fix it part. Though, spoiler alert, the story I'm going to tell you doesn't end, tidily. But you've all read David Wallace Wells, one of many important things to read out there. Certainly not, the centerpiece of where climate thinking is at, but an important one. You know that it's not as simple as, and here are the solutions. But let's talk about what we know we can do. So we like to lay out the challenges, the projections from our analyses, and then talk about the choices we have. And certainly we need to limit this extreme heat, and we also need to work hard to limit its accompanying harm. We focused on kind of 4 categories in our report. This is one way of capturing this. We need to put ourselves on a path toward rapid emissions reductions. We really need to keep people safe from extreme heat, and we need to start building the social infrastructure that we need to do that now. We need to invest in heat-smart infrastructure because from roads to inner cities, we are not prepared for the kind of temperatures we're going to be facing. And we need to invest in a climate-smart power system that doesn't just mean clean energy, but also a power system that isn't itself vulnerable to extreme heat. Because when it goes down, and the power goes down, and the AC goes down, during these kinds of heat waves, we're talking about a really, really dangerous situation. Another way to think about this is the confluence, the adaptation and mitigation working together. So we need to keep people safe in the immediate. This is about there's a number of things that we can do. Just to touch on a few of them. Right now, there is no national safety standard for outdoor workers. It's totally optional, really. The kind of support that employers provide to outdoor workers during extreme heat, and that needs to change. People are dying from working out in extreme heat. We need improved heat early warning systems. We need adaptation and emergency response plans. We need cooling standards for public housing. Right now, some of the most vulnerable people living in public housing don't have access to air conditioning, which is extremely dangerous. And we need to change, among other things, those utility disconnection policies. It sounds boring, but it means that utilities, right now, in lots of states, can shut people's power off regardless of their ability to pay and the season. And as I mentioned, that's a deadly confluence. Shut it off in summer, and people who can't keep cool are extremely vulnerable to heat-related illness and worse. And obviously we need to, I say obviously, reach net zero emissions by 2050. So let's look a little bit at that. So step 1, right? Gobsmackingly obvious, beating us over the head every day. We need to transition away from fossil fuels. And we know how to do this. We were on our way with the Clean Power Plan, and in the transportation sector with greenhouse gas and fuel efficiency standards for automobiles. The former, the Clean Power Plan, has been repealed, and those efficiency standards are set to be rolled back this year against the auto industry's wishes. They've actually asked that rollback not happen, but that rollback's still underway. So 1 step forward, 1.5 steps back, I'm not sure. We need to build a clean energy economy. We know how to do this too. Based on renewable electricity, we're seeing tremendous progress Wind power, as some of you folks probably know, has grown enormously, tenfold since 2003. The amount of electricity from wind power has doubled in the past 3 years alone. My colleague likes to say that the rate of progress in clean energy and efficiency is greater than anything we've seen in the past century when we made the leap from whale oil to petroleum in just a couple of decades. We're in that space where there's so much potential, there's so much that can be brought online. It just needs that support. There are headwinds here too. I hope that penetration of wind and solar makes the forward movement hard to stop. We shall see. And obviously, we need to be driving a different transportation system really altogether. We know how to do this, and we are doing this, particularly at the state level. We have state programs that support electric cars, support the deployment of electric bus fleets. This is certainly facing those headwinds, though, I mentioned, as the administration's efforts to repeal those efficiency standards are underway. So we know how to do all that, but there's a theme, right? There's real progress met with real opposition, and the net effect is that we're not doing enough of the good things and we're continuing to do too many of the bad things. As you know, we're already at 1 degree C, so we need to be on that green path, right? We need to be acting really swiftly and cutting emissions really deeply. Getting there is going to be really hard work and is not yet underway, right? We saw a flattening of emissions more or less for a couple of years ago. But global carbon emissions reached an all-time high in 2018. So apparently not everybody's pulling their weight. So who is that? Front and center, who's not pulling their weight? Here we are, the United States, in a class with Russia and Saudi Arabia in terms of being critically insufficient in our efforts to reduce emissions. So I don't mean to give you the bad news and a little bit of an upshot and then sort of rip it away. There's a lot to celebrate, and it's important to stay in that space and to make the most of what we have and the momentum we have. But this is really the story of climate change right now. We have all the information we need. We have viable options on the table. We've got tremendously exciting options right on the horizon, but we don't have the political will to get the job done. And even though it means everything, getting the job done. So we're sick of it. I know people in this room are, and here's where I want to refocus the story and bring us back to right now, and really to all of you, because one of the most important things to happen in the climate fight ever is you. The climate movement is something that I've been part of since I was Greta Thunberg's age. There wasn't much of one then, but it's grown more energized over time, but the youth climate movement is on fire. With leadership and inspiration of people like Greta and other young folks, this movement has really sprung up. It's not that it wasn't there, but it's really sprung to the fore in just the past year in a way that's more inspiring and promising than anything I've seen in a long time. The movement's primary tool, as many of you know, at the moment is climate strikes. Here we see a climate strike in Australia back on March 15th. This was a pretty big one involving strikes all around the world. I don't know, were any of you involved in the March 15th strike? Anybody? All right. Yeah, I have a senior in high school who was there, and they're both going to be at this next one. They're pretty fired up. So just another aspect of this youth climate movement on fire. This is these are the 21 young people between the ages of 12 and 23 who are suing the federal government over negligence on climate change, for not doing something about it sooner, for knowing. And that lawsuit faces an uphill battle, but it's now headed to the Supreme Court. And of course, the young people behind things like the Sunrise Movement have pushed cutting-edge policies, leading-edge visionary policies like the Green New Deal farther than they would have gone. So on September 20th, hopefully, millions of people in currently over 150 countries will be on strike over climate change. There have been lots of marches and lots of rallies in the past, which I've participated in, and they're really important, if for nothing else than to send us home, those of us who, have been sort of soaking in the bad news, send us home renewed and motivated for what comes next. But there's something about a strike that's very exciting because it disrupts, right? And business as usual has gotten us our business as usual emissions. Business as usual is incredibly comfortable. Business as usual needs some disruption. And a strike is a way to engage directly people who aren't going to be touched by us marching down the street with our signs, no matter how, funny and gorgeous they are. So there are over 500 events currently planned in the U.S., and I think there are more added every day as young people, college and high school age people, younger even, organize events in their own communities and schools. So why am I talking about the strike? UCS is supporting it. It's youth-led, and our job is to be in the background. Our job is to be supportive. Our job is to ask what you need and to find ways to help. But we're encouraging our members and our supporters, and we have over 500,000, to pay attention to this. And if they can, not everybody can take a day off of work, right? They risk their jobs, they can't miss the wages, they can't physically participate. But if you can, consider doing it. I feel so strongly about this that I wrote a blog for adults. A lot of adults were like, what is this strike thing? Kids are skipping school. Of course they're going to go and have a bunch of fun with a bunch of other truants, right? It's obviously so much more than that. So I tried to capture this in my blog, and I just had to show you. This is my moment in the sun. This is from today. If you Google what is the climate strike, that's me. That's my blog. So anyway, if you have any adults in your life who are skeptical, they would prefer you be in class, send them my way. Be happy to share this with them. So wrapping up, I talk a lot about climate change. I talk with a lot of people about climate change. And one of the things that I've been hearing in recent years from adults is, it's up to you now, younger generation. And you might welcome that. I find that infuriating. We have trashed the place, and now it's up to you. So the appropriate response, and you should demand this if you don't get it, from older folks is, like me, I'm sorry, and I'm going to do everything I can. It's your future that we're talking about, and we owe it to you. So I hope I saved time for questions and discussion, and thank you for listening.
Okay, so this mic is open if you want to come up and ask a question.
All right. Hi, my name is Sophie Buchholz. I'm a sophomore, environmental studies major and political science major. And I was just curious if you had anything to add about eating practices and that impact of that on climate change, especially meat and methane.
Eating practices. Yeah. We have, I don't know how helpful it will be to you, but we have a food and environment program at UCS, and we have put together a pretty comprehensive guide for folks who are really trying to look at each aspect of their life and think about ways to reduce their carbon footprint. And certainly, food is a huge, huge one. Food waste, meat. I don't have stats for you, but I know that they're powerful. It ranks quite high in the number of things you can do. Globally, if we were to cut meat consumption, it would have a huge impact. So, yeah, if we can do it, we should do it.
Yeah, so I guess that was like kind of following up on that question. Why don't you think that that is a focus in many environmental groups?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Why don't we kind of lead with it? I want to take that back to my colleagues. It's probably, I'm guessing, it's probably because it's still seen as such a personal choice. There's going to need to be a lot that we give up over time to get where we need to be in terms of global emissions reductions. It's almost like we don't want to talk about that yet, though, right? Things that we need to give up. And I don't mean, UCS necessarily. We're really trying to be really upfront and honest, but it's going to be a process. We need to get more people in and concerned, while at the same time being honest about the things that are going to need to change. I mean, there are lots of things that we can do today to make those deep reductions that don't necessarily hurt, right? But in order to go where we need to go, there will be changes that are much more noticeable.
Thank you.
I don't disagree with much of anything that you said, and I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing. My primary concern is that if we were to make the United States, the European Union, Australia, Canada carbon neutral tomorrow, a third to a half of the world, with China and India sort of at the front of the line, would still be desperately in the process of industrializing in very dirty ways. And you were just saying it's a nasty thing for us older people to say to the younger people. It's like, well, it's on you now. Right, as you know, the global version of that is the richer countries that already developed by trashing the planet, saying to people in India and China, yeah, I'm sorry you guys can't develop because, that would be too messy.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to picture how, the EU and the United States facilitate the clean development of what are economic rivals, or I don't know, this keeps me awake at night.
Yeah, there are wicked problems to solve for sure. It's a really great point, and I'm glad you raised it. My colleagues work in the international climate arena and attend the negotiations and are part of a climate action network. And one of the things that we're lobbying hard for is climate justice in an international context. And we're really quite far, I think, at the moment from achieving that, given that the U.S. is trying to withdraw? So there's a lot of sort of coming back and rebuilding that I hope we can do quickly in order to get to the really important international climate equity questions. We need to provide support to countries that have a lot of developing yet to do in order for people to be healthy and secure. If you listen to the fossil fuel industry, they'll tell you that's exactly why we need to keep consuming fossil fuels. And it's cruel to be thinking about focusing on renewables. These are things we have to get past. I hope that's...
Hi. So my question sort of is regarding the historical climate movement. In the past, especially in the United States, we've found that given how tied the economic interests are of highly wealthy people to the political trajectory of this country, how do we as like a mass movement overcome the extremely disproportionate amount of economic influence that the fossil fuel industry might weigh on our movement? As an example of this, we can look to like how the environmental movement of the 1970s very quickly shifted from this radical like anti-corporate movement to something very much focused on like personal responsibility and eating right and recycling and stuff like that, which isn't exactly as impactful as legislation.
Yeah. So I can speak from UCS's perspective. Your critique is a really important one, and certainly the big greens, of which we're like a little brother to the big greens, right? They have been, appropriately criticized. We've been appropriately criticized over the years for real blind spots. UCS has never taken corporate funding. We've never taken government funding. We are funded by individual donors. Our members provide the lion's share of our resources, and foundations. So we feel pretty independent of any of those pressures, and that's why we have been that way for all of that time. I think I don't have a good answer, but I think that the soul searching that the larger greens are doing around climate equity is an important pathway for us to walk, and it's one that can force us to examine really hard and really up close some of these issues, and how can we be organizations that are in a really transparent way fighting for the things that we've been fighting for alongside climate equity going forward.
Thank you very much.
It helps.
Hi. Are there any initiatives that UCS is working on or like pushing in order to get people more involved in climate change as an issue, like specifically targeting the group or the audience that has the financial means to do so?
That has the financial means to do so?
Yeah, like big corporations, people with like billionaires, people with a lot of money, because I feel like a lot of times in the conversation with climate change, they're talking a lot about personal responsibility and people making the change in their lives, but I'm just wondering if there's any like initiatives or anything that like USC or anyone is like doing in order to target the audience that has the ability to really do so or like make a difference.
Yeah, we're coming at it a little bit differently in that we're trying to target corporations that are bad actors and have been bad actors for a long time, and forcing them to, look at their practices and do things differently. We have an accountability campaign, which is focused on the fossil fuel industry and the really troubling parallels between the tobacco industry lying for years and years about the dangers of smoking, and that suddenly coming to light. There are strong reflections in the fossil fuel industry. They've basically had this very well coordinated disinformation campaign working for decades now, right? They're one of the key reasons that we're still trying to, we find ourselves having to say over and over again that climate change is real. So I think rather than invest our energy in trying to engage good actors to do the right thing, there are groups that are doing that, and that's important and positive. We're focusing on those that are obstructions to climate progress and really big, important, obstructive actors, and trying to get them to change.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm just wondering if you could go more into detail about what heat smart infrastructure might look like and how our current infrastructure is affected by possible heat, these extreme heat events. Maybe is it like, for instance, how a bridge might be affected by unprecedented heat expansion or something like that, and if it looks like that or something like that.
Yeah. So there's, it's a great question. There are major pieces of infrastructure that we rely on every day, our highways, our rail, our runways, that just because of the materials they're made of are vulnerable during extreme heat. They can buckle, they can melt. Airplanes, if it's hot enough, can't get the lift to actually take off. So we're going to be investing in infrastructure in the coming years, in the very near term as a country, because our infrastructure is famously crumbling in a lot of ways. So one of the important things to push for is climate smart investment, right? We should not be building a single piece of infrastructure that isn't that isn't ready, that isn't climate ready, and prepared for the kind of conditions that it's going to see in its lifetime. Because of course, infrastructure is really long-lived. But then there's also the the smaller scale infrastructure, the urban landscapes that are create such incredible heat during the summer unnecessarily, when some simple cooling infrastructure, if brought online, could make a really big difference there. So it's improving, making more climate ready the big infrastructure, and then bringing on more cooling infrastructure as well. And that's just for heat, right? There's extreme precipitation and flooding, there's sea level rise and coastal flooding, there's wildfires, there's a range of different ways that we're exposed to climate impacts on an infrastructure front that we need to address. But in terms of heat, that's how we're viewing it.
Thank you very much.
In the United States, I think that there is a lot of media coverage when it comes to climate change, but when it's about developing countries, people don't really know about, they feel the consequences, but they don't know what they are in the long term. So my question is, how do you think we here can help developing countries know about climate change and how they can improve? Because I feel like those are the countries that are going to be affected the most for climate change.
Certainly. So the UNFCCC framework has provided for support to developing countries to assess their vulnerability to climate change and to plan to adapt. So there's, there are mechanisms in place. We've withdrawn a fair amount of our support for international, to developing countries for climate activities. I don't know the specifics, whether it's impacting those analyses and assessments, but I wouldn't be surprised. So making sure that those, that these countries have the opportunity to get a technical, scientific, robust understanding of what they're facing is one piece, right? It's also, I used to work in climate change vulnerability and assessment for developing countries, and found it just mind-boggling to be talking with my Sudanese team about the collapse in agriculture, and turning around and living here in the States where we weren't thinking about climate change at all, let alone the plight of anybody else. So we have, with the political wins, our support, our concern for the plight of developing countries in a climate change world changes, and it needs to change back in a big way. And there needs to be, I'm forgetting the process, but there's talk in the climate negotiations about additional funding to compensate for the loss that developing countries are going to face, on a whole bunch of different fronts as they try to develop, and that needs resources. I hope that's helpful. It's a good and tricky question.
Thank you.
Hello. I spent the summer working in corporate social responsibility and environmental sustainability. And while there's work being done, like you said, corporations are incredibly talented actors. My question is about being a responsible consumer. So what does that look like from your perspective, and how can we make sure that we're spending our money and spending our time in corporations and companies that are not contributing to climate change?
That's a great question. I'm not as up on the latest tools that enable you to do that, but there are some really creative ones. There are credit cards that basically stop your spending when you've reached a certain carbon budget. Now, how many people are actually going to successfully use that credit card when they haven't managed to finish paying, for the groceries or whatever? But it's out there. It's thought-provoking and pretty cutting edge, and received some awards and whatnot. So that's a kind of tool. There are other, trackers, and there are certainly lists of good corporate actors to steer our investment toward. And then there's, the buying less, right? The whole realm of a whole approach to our consumption that just involves not making that purchase. So there are far better resources out there than me to answer your question, but I'd be happy to think about it and try and send you some ideas.
Thank you.
Hi, so during your presentation, you mentioned something about the heat island effect. So I was just wondering if you could explain exactly what it is and if there's anything we can do to maybe prevent that.
I'm sorry, could you say just the last part, explain what it is and what?
Yeah, explain what it is and maybe what we can do to maybe bring an end to that or something.
Sure. So the urban heat island effect is when on a warm day, the landscape, the man-made materials in the urban landscape absorb heat, and then at night release it. They release it during the day as well, right, and elevate the temperature during the day. But it's really critical to human physiology, even to our state of mind, to get a break from extreme heat and to have the night cool down. You can sleep, you can get some rest, you can wake up and deal with the heat again the next day. But the urban heat island effect, because it keeps the temperatures so elevated, sort of throughout the entire day and night, prevents that. And it also just elevates the temperature so that you see these spikes in cities compared to the surrounding areas. There are simple things that we can bring online, and that some cities are. I believe LA is doing a lot of white roof painting. Tree cover is a very obvious and very effective way of creating shade and cool spaces within the urban environment. There are a range of other approaches that are not terribly costly, but can make quite an impact. And the unfortunate thing is, when you look at, there's a study that just came out that looked at income levels and tree cover in cities that experience the urban heat island effect. And not too surprisingly, the places where people are poorest lack the trees and are hottest, and also have the fewest resources to cope during those conditions. So it's something we need to address as we start adapting to extreme heat.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is, what do we do and how do we call people to action who aren't as concerned? How do we talk them into being not apathetic and working towards ending climate change?
Yeah, that's the gajillion-dollar question. So we work in the space of trying to make plain for people the way that the things they care about and the people they care about are at risk. And it's been effective to a certain extent. I know we've reached people. We've had 2,500 media hits on just this last heat report. So we've certainly reached a large audience, and when people are sweltering in that heat and seeing the projections, there's a connection to be made. But how does it really hit home, and how do you make a decision to do something different? It's got to be just talking to people who, talking as a trusted person with someone who needs to hear it. You've probably heard recently that teenage girls are incredibly effective. I know that, I have two of them, but incredibly effective with their parents who are skeptics, bringing them around just by sitting down and having conversations about it. Katharine Hayhoe, you've probably heard her name. She's a well-known climate scientist, brilliant communicator, has a good TED Talk about this, about how you talk to people, how we bridge those divides. But take some risks, and I hate to say we shouldn't be too challenging. We should challenge people on the science, sure, but maybe invite people to tell us what they see. What do you see? What do you think? And start a conversation there. I don't know. My fingers are crossed for you.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm with 350 Central Mass, the folks who are helping with the organization of the climate marches on the 20th and the 27th here in Worcester. And you mentioned the extreme heat this summer. My niece got married on July 20th in an outdoor ceremony, and it was 94 degrees when they exchanged vows. It was, we were grateful for the forest canopy that was close by. But my brother lives in, or he works in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And through the summer, he was describing the 120, 125, 128 degree temperatures that they had. And he works in a school that's modern. And so there's actually underground connectors between all the buildings, so nobody has to go outside. Are you aware of other, and this summer I participated with WPI in doing a heat island effect study. The city of Worcester was broken into a dozen quadrants, and we, on the hot days, went out and took data and measured it at 6 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, 7 at night, and that report will be coming out in the next several weeks. But are you aware of other retrofit activities that can be done to existing infrastructure? You mentioned white roofs, other things such as any spray cooling on buildings, painting blacktop white to change the albedo of the city from the in terms of its emissivity and absorption.
Mm-hmm.
Are you aware of other research or efforts underway to do that?
I'm aware of some research and some efforts underway to do that. I'm not an expert in it yet. We've spent the last 6 years on the coast looking at sea level rise, and we're now stepping into this extreme heat space. But we have some leading scientists as our advisors, and certainly people like Larry Kalkstein, I'm not sure if you've heard his name, have been doing a lot of work on this, and estimates that, with bringing some of these technologies online, like films on windows, in high rises and whatnot, we can, they suggest that cities could keep temperatures essentially as they are today, the real feel of the temperatures essentially as they are today through 2050, despite warming, just by lots of cooling technology. So there's a particular group that he's doing this work through, and I could find that and share it with you. I think they'd be definitely a group to talk to. And yeah, then there are just the really obvious simple things, as you say, changing the albedo effect, white paint, tree cover. So if you're still here, maybe we can exchange details and I can follow up.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I noticed earlier in your presentation you mentioned an increase in environmentally friendly technology. I was just wondering if you've seen an increase in net zero housing or net zero interest for different architectural interests.
I'm sorry, I missed if I've seen an increase in net zero?
In net zero housing, architectural technology, and that way.
Yeah, I would need to connect you with one of my colleagues for an informed answer. I feel like I have, but my world is not necessarily the representative of the general public, right? I'm tuned into those kinds of changes. And we don't work on buildings at UCS, but we do have a clean energy group which is informed about that. And I'd be happy to connect you with someone who might have who would have a better answer.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Hi, I understand we have to do as much as we can to stop climate change, but with what we're doing now, is it enough to forestall or the direct impacts of climate change, or is it too little too late?
What we're doing right now?
Yeah.
What we're doing right now is not enough. What we could be doing in a couple of years could be an entirely different story. With an administration that is really prioritizing climate action, as a national imperative, we could we could be bringing all kinds of important changes online that would be consistent with the deep cuts we need to make, right? We need to start on a path and keep adding, keep adding to it as we go, so that we are continuing to do the harder stuff. There's easy stuff we should be doing, and it's stupid not to be doing. As we get started, we need to bring the cutting edge technologies online, the deeper emissions cuts. We need to be in a very different place in 5, 7, 10 years. Because we're not doing it today doesn't mean that we can't be, with some important changes in political will.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like that's everyone. Well, those were amazing questions, and an amazing crowd, and I'm really so grateful to you all for coming, for staying. Thank you, and I'm happy to hang around and chat if anyone wants to continue the discussion. Thanks.